Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for the CIL seminar on facilitating private investment to fund climate change mitigation and net zero policies. This is the third of six in the seminar series on climate change and investment. I'm Rayla Puno and I'm a research associate here at the NUS Center for International Law. Today we're fortunate to hear from five distinguished panelists, and there will be a moderated discussion afterward. There will be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions through the chat box. I will now hand over the floor to our moderator for today, Daniel Yao, Head of the Climate Change Law and Policy Program and Adjunct Senior Research Fellow at CIL.
Thank you very much, Ryla, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Very warm welcome to our panel of experts and also the many participants joining us from across the world at this third installment. And the theme for today is on facilitating private investment to fund climate change mitigation and net zero policies. And following on quite smoothly from the earlier seminars where we have already addressed the theme of investment protection and regulatory reform for climate change in Asia, and the second session, which talks about compensation and valuation in climate claims under investment treaties. Now, it is well recognized. And why are we talking about this theme today? Well, essentially, it is well recognized that private investment can play an important role in the ability of states to take the steps necessary to contain climate change while coping with its effects. According to the IMF, developing economies must collectively invest at least $1 trillion in energy infrastructure by 2030 and $3 to 6 trillion across all sectors per year by 2050 in order to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Our seminar today is particularly timely in the wake of the release of the final installment of the IPCC 6th assessment report on 20th of March 2023, just 2 days ago. Now, some of the key findings of the report I wanted to take this opportunity to flag up because of its relevance to the theme for today. Just to reiterate, what are the key findings? Now, just some of them. One, of course, is that the human-induced global warming has so far precipitated unprecedented changes to the Earth's climate, and further warming will only increase the magnitude of these changes, as well as heightening the possibility of our climate system reaching quite dangerous tipping points. The number one cause of this climate crisis is the world's addiction or reliance on burning fossil fuels, which the world must all rapidly shift away from. Future carbon dioxide emissions from existing and planned fossil fuel infrastructure alone is estimated to surpass the net 510 gigatons CO2, sort of a carbon budget before that is calculated at the moment. Now, with respect to mitigation measures, what is necessary, according to IPCC, is urgent whole of society system-wide transformations in order to secure a net zero climate resilient future. For example, power generation, buildings, industry, transport, agriculture, forestry, so on and so forth. Mere decarbonization across all systems, however, seems to be insufficient. The IPCC points to the dependence to need to depend on some quantity of carbon removal, whether it's nature-based solution or more emergent direct air capture technologies. So this, at the earlier point, just has been flagged, perhaps indicates where the investment dollars needs to shift and needs to go to. Coming to finance, in terms of adaptation measures to build effective climate resilience, what the IPCC report also mentions is the need for a dramatic increase in finance needed to scale solutions. According to the IPCC, developing countries alone will need $127 billion per year by 2030 and $295 billion per year by 2050 to adapt to climate change. But funds for adaptation are so far woefully inadequate. And finally, the point that is also relevant to our discussion today, the importance of ensuring a just transition as the world moves towards a net zero emissions climate resilient future. So in brief, the IPCC report that was just released 2 days ago underscores the continued negative effect of the climate crisis on countries' economic, national security, as well as the clear urgency for financial technological and governmental coordination to spur meaningful change. So the key message for today's seminar really is the need, it seems, for a dramatic increase in climate finance this decade for both mitigation and adaptation. Where are we, however, in that score? The gap seems to be widest in developing countries at the moment. And whereas recent mitigation investments, it seems, we need to increase by at least sixfold in the Southeast Asian region and in developing countries in the Pacific region. So that's where we are today, right? So question here is this: while many institutional investors and corporations have already expanded and deepened their climate commitments in the past few years, is the pace sufficient? Where and how can governments come in to facilitate private investments to fund climate change mitigation and net zero policies? Is there a magic bullet or playbook? To assist us in this quest, we will turn to our panel of experts today to examine how different states facilitate Paris-aligned investments, with a special focus on Asian developing countries, such as in China and the Philippines in this part of the world. Asia is one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world, but also one of the largest emitters of the CO2 emissions, responsible for about half the world's annual CO2 emissions as well. Countries in Asia have also traditionally relied heavily on fossil fuel resources. By discussing how different developing Asian countries are trying to facilitate green investments, our discussions today will aim to provide some insights into the drivers and content of those policies and their effectiveness in facilitating investments that can fund climate change mitigation. Right. So with that, let me turn to our first speaker, Dr. Rolando Avendano. He's an economist at the Economic Research and Cooperation Department of the Asian Development Bank, having previously worked for the OECD. Now, Ms. Dr. Avendano, can I now invite you first to address us on the ADB's perspective of how states in Asia are facilitating Paris-aligned investments, as well as the potential obstacles. Dr.
Thank you.
Avendano, please.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you again to the Center for International Law and the National University of Singapore for this invitation. It is a very timely topic, and I've had the chance to watch the whole webinar series where you have excellent themes discussed by very, very prominent experts on the topic. So we are really happy to be part of this discussion. And let me just start. I have some slides, so I will share my presentation. So the topic of how aligning investment and climate change goals in Asia and the Pacific is, of course, very relevant from the perspective of the Asian Development Bank. And in particular, in the department where I come from, we are trying also to understand a lot of these linkages and define which are the areas where we see, as it was mentioned by Danielle, governments can also design interventions that are effective in trying to align investments towards climate change goals. So just as a motivation, this project was part of our latest Asian Economic Integration report, where we dedicated our team chapter to exploring the linkages between trade and international investment and climate change. I will try to focus my presentation on the investment part, but I would like also to introduce some basic figures on what are the trends in terms of performance in the region on international trade, on carbon emissions of trade, and also on the carbon intensity of international investment. So perhaps the first question that we had when addressing this question was really, how does Asia's development model can define the investment patterns and the carbon footprint in the region? And to understand that, we had to look a bit more closely at how the data what the data tells us in terms of how investments are being defined in the region. And also on a second phase, understanding how Asian economies are aligning their investment policy frameworks to the commitments that they have been agreeing, in particularly through the Paris Agreement. And lastly, we focus on some of the policies that we think from the perspective of investment policy and more specifically of foreign investment, how they can better integrate these policies into climate action. And we look at these 4 policies that we mentioned in this slide and that I will describe more in detail in my presentation. As I was mentioning, this was the motivation of this study, and the 4 policies I was mentioning at the end are in this slide, and this is going to be some of the key points of my presentation. So just to summarize very quickly what we had done in our analysis, we start from the premise that the global demand in general of goods and services could not have been met without Asia's rapid expansion in terms of production, in terms of increasing trade, as a result, increasing emissions. And Asia in general has been a net exporter of carbon emissions, and this is why it puts the region at the front line of climate change, not only because of its domestic policy, but also of its spillovers in terms of international trade and international investment. And what we want to understand is also what are the trade-offs that the region has been trying to balance in improving its capacity for production, its diversification, and its industrialization, with the costs that have been also embedded in this through increasing carbon emissions. So what we have seen when we look at the data in terms of emissions, of carbon emissions of the region, and we compare with other regions, is that in general, carbon emissions in Asia have been relatively high. We can also normalize or take a more standard measure dividing by the population to have a more clear understanding, because we cannot compare regions without taking into account the size of the population. And in general, what we can see is a decreasing emission intensity across most regions, including Asia and the Pacific, both in terms of carbon exports and imports. However, the region continues to be one of the highest emitters, even when correcting by population measures. And this is very linked, as I mentioned, to the industrial structure of the region, which is very much focused on sectors which are carbon intensive. And for this, we study different standards or measures or classifications to understand what are the industries where we see there is a higher carbon intensity. And even if the region has made significant improvements when we compare to other regions, in particular the European Union or North America, we see that the carbon emissions intensity continues to be higher given the sectors where the region specializes. So there is a structural factor that is difficult to address because it's structural and it requires also some reflection when we think about investment policy and long-term investment strategies. Another point I wanted to raise was on the relationship between foreign investment, environmental regulations, and environmental outcomes. And this is a very complex relationship where it's not easy to disentangle a single effect. Environmental regulations have been introduced in the region in the last 20 years. They have had positive effects in terms of environmental outcomes. They have also been, in some cases, detrimental to attracting FDI into some specific development member countries. But the conclusion is that the relationship between environmental regulations and environmental performance and foreign investment tends to be very complex, and we cannot really generalize. It also depends on how we measure the stringency of these regulations, how do we measure the environmental policies that have been introduced. And this has consequences in terms of how we look at this question of how can investment policy, for example, improve some aspects. In a very current discussion is on energy transition, for example, where we look at aspects like energy consumption, energy efficiency, and what are the environmental spillovers. So we cannot make a generalization of what could be the effects of foreign direct investment and what is the role of environmental regulations. We have much more evidence today to understand these linkages and to try to disentangle them. In general, and regardless of the classification that we use, the region in the same case as in trade tends to be very concentrated in carbon intensive industries. And this is what we try also to show in some of the in our report and in some of the research that we produced. And this is a long-term trend that is not going to change in the short term. East Asia within the region plays a prominent role in terms of attracting the carbon intensive foreign investment. And this is important also because, as I mentioned, the structure of the economy tends to be one important determinant of the policies that can be adopted. So we advocate for four main policies that can make that trade and investment be part more of these climate solutions. And I will describe very briefly some of these and relates also some of these to the investment policy aspects. Promoting trade and investment on environmental goods and services clearly is one of the significant policies that have been introduced. And this is explained not only by the decrease on the cost of environmental goods in the last 20 years, but also by some positive and important policies introduced in many countries, in particular in areas such as energy. And this is also reflected in the data when we look at how foreign direct investment is attracting more and more projects and investments in areas such as electric power, solar electric power. So there is a large potential for this to continue, and this is going to be one of the pillars to define some of the investment policy in the region. At the same time, there are limitations that have been important that have been also highlighted in the discussions in the region. One of them, for example, is on the limitations of list approach classifications, which tend to be very limited in terms of how or what we consider to be an environmental good or an environmental services. Another aspect is how environmental services is particularly overlooked in the region. And they only represent 2% of the total services exports in the region, and they show that there is a lot of potential to grow, but it's still unexploited. A second aspect that we look at is in terms of what we mean by greening businesses and nurturing greening businesses, which is basically a combination of three different areas in terms of policy. One, in terms of environmental laws and regulations that have been introduced in the last 30 years, and more recently, the introduction of policy incentives that we will probably discuss during the panel today, to stimulate and to increase investment on green industries or green sectors. And third, the introduction of much more established certification systems and standards in the region. So these have been three areas where the region has been moving very quickly. Also in terms of, for example, management practices for environmental sustainability and ensuring that these tools are accessible not only for large firms and multinationals, but also for small and medium enterprises has been also one of the priorities in some countries in the region. Certification, as I mentioned, is an area where there is a lot of changes in the last 5 years, and they continue to define also what will be the future of the green businesses strategies. And this is one of the pillars also that we look in detail in our report. The third pillar is more related to strengthening international cooperation and regulation. And this refers both on the trade and the investment dimensions. On the trade side, as I mentioned, is more related to environmental goods, trade facilitation, and on investment, it really looks more at how the international investment agreements are adapting or responding to the climate commitments. And there are different policies that are being introduced. We discussed some of these. One of them is the introduction of a model agreement that could possibly address some of the issues in terms of reform of the international investment policy framework. A second one is not looking also at the regulatory aspects, but also favoring some of the more positive aspects in terms of market access and the trade-offs between increasing access and reducing restrictions to foreign investment, while also maintaining some of the priorities for strategic sectors, which is an important area when looking at investments on key areas such as energy. So we look at these aspects and we look at how they can respond, but they will definitely be part of the solution in terms of how trade and investment respond. Finally, green economy agreements, which is a new generation of agreements that focus on specific areas of technology cooperation or energy agreements, is a promising area, and we see that they are increasingly more important in some countries. Australia, Singapore is the example that we explore more in detail, but there are other initiatives that aim to target more specific areas of cooperation for investment on environmental and green industries. And finally, well, just to give a bit more detail on this area of international investment agreements, we are also trying to understand how these are being mapped in terms of the international agreements that are being that exist in the region, and which are the provisions, for example, that are more considered to be part of the climate-related provisions, and still very few international investment agreements include this in the region, but we see some increasing trend, and we try to also understand what are the effects on the allocation of foreign investment after the introduction of these provisions, or more stronger elements on the international investment agreements. And finally, the last aspect is more related to the carbon pricing, which is an essential part of the global climate change architecture, and the region is still trying to seize the momentum. The carbon border adjustment mechanism has been gaining traction, and other regions are implementing it, and probably it will have repercussions on how we define the trade and investment policy in Asia-Pacific region. So it needs to be taken into account when defining the future or new investment policies or new investment incentives in the region. And we also look at some of the global pricing mechanisms that should be, in the end, the long-term objectives to address the carbon leakage. And these are now contained in the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and how building intermediary solutions, in particular through bilateral agreements included in the Article 6.2 and the regional carbon market alliances, can continue these efforts to have a more global carbon pricing mechanism in the region. So these are the key aspects I wanted to discuss, and I look forward to the discussion and to the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Avendano, for setting the stage very well for the discussions to follow, the status and the current status and the assessment of where we are in terms of the necessary areas and action to be taken in specific sectors which are more carbon intensive. As you say, so it continues to be so, it seems, and more efforts in terms of investment policies would need to be geared towards addressing those pain points, so to speak. And thank you very much also for sharing the key findings from ADV's the Asian Economic Integration Report. I've popped the link into the chat for those who would like to read the full report as well as the summary, a lot of important information there. I found in particular the 4 pillars that you shared to be very, very critical, and I hope that in the discussions to follow, we can come back, circle back to address some of that. Now, with that, can I now invite my colleague, Dr. Jensen Kalanita, to address us on the key questions to follow in terms of the overview of the WTO investment facility framework, as well as the facilitation provisions in RCEP and the ASEAN framework. Jensen does not require any further introduction. He's the head of our investment law and policy here at the center, and very much a key driver of this series. Jensen, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Let me share my slides if I can, and get us started. Can I ask if you can see my slides?
Yes, Jensen.
Terrific. Well, I want to pick up, I guess, exactly where Dr. Avendano led us off and shift us a little bit to the legal frameworks for investment facilitation, particularly the frameworks that are in place or being discussed at the international level. And this is an area where I've been looking with many others over the past several years in the context of the WTO's ongoing work, but particularly here in Asia, in ASEAN, in RCEP, we see particular developments as well that I'd like to discuss. And much of this is based on a recent report done by myself and Stephanie Chakra from Singapore Management University for UNISCAP on the situation in East Asia. So to pick up from where Rolando had us, it's just to reinforce the idea and the reality that addressing climate change is going to require investment, and it's going to require mammoth amounts of investment. According to the IMF, for example, somewhere in the neighborhood of 130 trillion US in order to achieve the Paris 1.5 degree goal. But it's also worth bearing in mind, of course, as Dr. Avendano also told us, that not all investment is green investment, and not all investment supports climate change, mitigation, adaptation, or even sustainable development. Nevertheless, when one looks at the broader picture, especially for developing and least developed economies, foreign investment remains the key source of external finance and the key source to which these economies are going to need to turn in order to address these very pressing issues. So when we think of investment facilitation, then this is essentially the tool that virtually every state in the world uses to facilitate investment into the economy in one way or another, whether that's to attract new investment, to retain existing investment, or to encourage reinvestment. And I want to emphasize here that what we're talking about are domestic measures. These are measures adopted by states as a matter of their own domestic law. And this has been a practice of states for many, many years, long preceding sustainable development goals, long preceding climate change goals. States have sought to attract and to facilitate investment just as a matter of their own interest. What are we talking about when we're talking about facilitating inward investment? UNCTAD has the nice definition: the set of policies and actions aimed at making it easier for investors to establish and expand their investments, as well as to conduct the day-to-day business of those investments. And there can be some overlap with investment promotion, depending upon how one considers it. But when we're thinking of investment facilitation, generally the idea are measures that that improve the transparency of the legal system for foreign investors, streamline the administrative processes that investors have to deal with, and create mechanisms for foreign investors to address issues that they may encounter in the day-to-day operations of their investment without needing to escalate things into formal disputes, be they in court, arbitration, or wherever. As I say, these are issues and policies that are adopted on the domestic level. And just to look at some World Bank numbers from a few years ago, if we were to take some of the measures of the Doing Business Index as a proxy for measures designed to facilitate investments, economies around the world continue to push forward with measures designed to attract and facilitate foreign investment into their economies, again, just as a matter of domestic law. Foreign investment facilitation, however, is increasingly attracted international attention, and beginning with APEC in 2008, but steadily throughout the last decade, different organizations have provided assistance to developing economies generally in terms of guidelines and frameworks for how to maximize the impact of facilitation measures, how to design them and how to implement them. It's fair to say, however, though, that these guidelines have not been focused on climate change and have only more recently begun to consider sustainable development goals. At the same time as organizations like UNCTAD and the G20 and OECD have been putting forward guidelines to help states through essentially soft law support and technical assistance, we've seen more laterally, increasingly, the inclusion of investment facilitation provisions in treaties themselves, whether that be in investment protection treaties or in chapters of free trade agreements, whether it be through regional frameworks, which I want to talk a little bit about the ASEAN Investment Facilitation Framework, more bilateral treaties more specifically focused on investment facilitation or green economy, as Rolando mentioned with respect to Australia and Singapore. And now the ongoing and nearly concluded WTO negotiations on a multilateral instrument for investment facilitation. So if we look at where things stand in ASEAN in terms of addressing investment facilitation through international instruments, and start there and then finish up by looking at the WTO. But just to start with ASEAN and where things are in ASEAN's investment agreements, and particularly those with its ASEAN plus partners, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, China, India, and Hong Kong. Going back and looking at the existing bilateral agreements between ASEAN and these states, and including as well the ASEAN Comprehensive Investment Agreement, or ACIA, in 2009, we see that already from 2009, attention was being given in some of these treaties, although not all of them, to the idea of investment facilitation. And typically, this concerned regulatory transparency, ensuring that investors would be able to know the law of the state in which they're investing, and generalized commitments to endeavor to improve administrative processes. Very often, treaties also taking into account the need for special and differential treatment, particularly among the less developed ASEAN economies. But what's noticeable is the absence of any linkage between having provisions on investment facilitation and any greater policy good. For example, sustainable development or climate change. Climate change not mentioned in any of these treaties at all, and we see no linkage between sustainable development either in any of these ASEAN treaties over the last 10 to 15 years. Now, of course, within the last 3 years, ASEAN has concluded its largest free trade agreement, namely RCEP. And if we look at RCEP, we see virtually no change. There are specific articles addressing investment facilitation. There's a chapter on development cooperation, but there's no linkage between investment facilitation and sustainable development. There is a reference in the preamble, but there's no operational effort, or there's no effort to operationalize the use of investment facilitation measures, the reason that states might adopt investment facilitation measures, and a goal like sustainable development or the mitigation of climate change. That is also the case in the ASEAN Investment Facilitation Framework, which was concluded in 2021. The ASEAN Investment Facilitation Framework is expressly a non-legally binding document, but it addresses in the classic areas of investment facilitation that we've seen in prior instruments: transparency, streamlining, and expediting administrative processes, and so forth. But again, even in 2021, in a non-legally binding document, there's no reference to sustainable development, no reference to climate change, no reference to the purpose for which states may want to or may need to seek to facilitate investment. So that brings me to the WTO agreement, which, as many of you will know, is now very close to being concluded with the release confidentially of the draft of December 2022. This is a document that's been under discussion and negotiation for coming on 6 years. And what's noteworthy, again, about the WTO's draft is that it proceeds under the title of Investment Facilitation for Development. But when one looks at it, one doesn't find very much that connects what the agreement provides for and actual sustainable development, and again, let alone climate change. The key pillars of the agreement: transparency, streamlining, the establishment of contact points or ombudspersons, and special and differential treatment for developing and least developed states. There is a chapter that proceeds under the title of sustainable investment, but does little more than provide for oratory, voluntary encouragement to encourage investors to adopt ESG policies and corporately social responsible practices. The object, nevertheless, as expressed in the agreement, is to facilitate foreign investment with the aim of sustainable development. But again, there aren't any provisions in the agreement that target the prioritization of investment for sustainable development. There's no mention of climate change. And the facilitation commitments in the agreement apply to all FDI, whether in fossil fuels, whether in non-renewables, whether in renewables. In other words, whether the investment tends to promote sustainable development, whether it's Paris-aligned, or whether it's not. So that brings me to a perhaps somewhat somber conclusion about where things stand in terms of international instruments and their efforts to, or their capacity to prioritize or encourage sustainable investment. And that is, they don't. And in the absence of provisions that are aimed at prioritizing and promoting sustainable investment, climate change, aligned investment, it remains for individual states to determine the policies that they will need to adopt and that they're capable of adopting. The best case scenario, I think, out of all of these international frameworks is that they may provide some additional capacity building resources, some additional technical assistance resources for developing economies that can use and sincerely need assistance in crafting the policies that work best for their priorities and their economies. But I do think that it is rather much a missed opportunity in these recent treaties not to emphasize or a missed opportunity to emphasize and support Paris-aligned investment. And in that respect, I just would close with an alternative scenario, a counterfactual that we might have hoped to have seen in the WTO agreement, but have not, and that is language taken from the current draft Angola EU Sustainable Investment Facilitation Agreement. Still a draft, but noting particularly in the context of investment facilitation that the parties do so in the context of also committing to effectively implementing the Paris Agreement and to promoting mutual support for investment and climate policies that contribute to a low carbon transition. Yes, these are also rather soft commitments, perhaps, but I think that this kind of emphasis and this kind of language adds value and certainly would have added some value to the WTO's current draft. Thank you very much. That's where I'll stop.
Thank you, Jensen, very much. That was a really useful overview of the legal framework on investment facilitation. And what is very telling, despite the labels to the WTO draft investment facilitation, is really the seeming lack of, I won't say coordination, but the seeming lack of, a seeming disjunct between what is being stated, recognized, and what we see in the text of these agreements. And the question really is, why is that so? I'm jumping a gun a little into the into discussions later. I just wanted to flag it so that we can all panelists can have a chance to think about this. But why is that so? Why is there so the dissonance, so to speak? Does it point to a simply internal domestic a need for more coherence and more coordination between domestic investment and environment, climate change officials? Does it point to a certain more, a need for a paradigm shift among trade negotiated investment negotiations, who traditionally been a little bit more reticent of erosion or attempts to kind of erode the structure of trade rules through introduction of traditionally non-trade investment related considerations? I think that would be a question that we can, but I hopefully we can come to. So with those two very, very wonderful presentations, this segues very well now to what Jensen has left us with, which is where individual states can come in to at a country level to address the question of promotion and investment facilitation for green investments at the country level. Let me now first turn to Governor Marjorie Ramos Samaniego from the Philippines Board of Investment. She's extremely experienced in policy making, legal planning, compliance, operations, and management, and has also responsible as the Philippines lead negotiator for investment agreements, including chair of the RCEP investment chapter and also currently ASEAN chair for the investment chapter on the ASEAN-Canada Free Trade Agreement. So a wonderful expert on this and many questions to be posed. So over to you, Governor Ramos, to share with us on Philippines' approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. May I ask if you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well, and we can see your screen, although it needs to probably move to presentation, the screen
Okay.
mode, because you can see that.
So thank you, and thank you to the Center for International Law, National University of Singapore for the invitation. Allow me to provide to you the Philippine policy setting on facilitating foreign investment, specifically to fund climate change mitigation and adaptation. Okay, so let's go to international commitments that we have. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So on the international commitments relating to climate change mitigation and adaptation, the Philippines' strong national economic fundamentals allow for deeper engagement to advance sustainability and not just on the domestic front. And in terms of Philippine international trade commitment, it is reflected on several fronts. First is outside ASEAN. The Philippine European Free Trade States, FTA, incorporates trade and sustainable development as countries move towards achieving economic activities and principles that advance environmental, labor, and sustainable development principles, specifically environmental technologies, sustainable renewable energy, as well as goods and services that are energy efficient, eco-labeled, or subject to schemes such as fair and ethical trade are promoted and facilitated. Now, another is the Philippines as an EU generalized scheme of preferences plus eligible is effectively implementing 27 conventions that aim to encourage compliance with human and labor rights, good governance, and sustainability. So further, this EU GSP plus eligibility of the Philippines is being used to foster an enabling environment for the private sector to champion and instill good practices that will increase competitiveness in terms of quality and adherence to labor and environmental standards. Further, the Philippines remains compliant with APEC environmental goods list in 2012, which is aimed at reducing the tariff rates at 5% or less for 54 environmental goods. So we know that access to products with lower tariff cost can reinforce environmental projects and support national goals to increase deployment of renewables and pursue total electrification, among others. More importantly, the Philippines supports discussion on non-tariff measure products to ensure that these are not trade restrictive and costly, and to effectively facilitate trade on environmental goods within the region. Lastly, in ASEAN, intra-ASEAN investment for the top 5 industries other than manufacturing rose from $17 billion to $18.5 billion. This shows that indeed there is a big opportunity to infuse trade in environmental goods across these industries as ASEAN sees emerging investment opportunities. The Philippines also recognizes the ASEAN Climate ACRF implementation plan under the broad strategy advancing towards a more sustainable, resilient future. And the Philippines also looks forward to a fruitful discussion on a possible ASEAN guidelines on sustainable investments. Maybe this is the thing which Hansen was mentioning. There's really no provision on the investment facilitation with respect to trade and sustainable development goals. But of course, they are part of the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, is part of the larger picture for the investment facilitation. Then how does the Philippines domestically incorporate green economy? Can we go to the next slide, please? Next slide. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So industry roadmaps are used in our country to facilitate or to develop industries. And this one, we are greening a lot of industry roadmaps. This is supported by the German Agency for International Cooperation. It's what you call Greening the Industry Roadmap, which is an offshoot of the Promotion for GED, which aims to integrate green economic development in the industry sector policies of the Philippines. So this aims, and it seeks to propel climate smart, environment-friendly, and globally competitive industries, particularly in the area of all of these manufacturing sectors. It includes automotive manufacturers, auto parts industry, pulp and paper industry, plastic industry, housing industry, and the furniture industry. So in cooperation as well with other government entities, the Department of Trade and Industry is tasked to contribute to setting framework conditions and to building up capacities that support a paradigm shift towards an innovation process that results in competitiveness, good environmental performance, climate change resilience, and job creation. Next slide, please. Okay, we also have a lot of initiatives, ongoing initiatives on the implementation of green economy. Some of these initiatives are actually undertaken by the Board of Investments. First is on plastics. The Board of Investments is also working with the local plastic industry on marine litter for a zero to waste initiative. The Philippine Plastic Industries Association has been collaborating with several stakeholders, institutions, and managing this to find alternative ways to plastic packaging. We also have on automotive, for several years now, we have been advocating for the adoption and manufacture of e-vehicles or the electric vehicles. This activity has been listed for several years now in our investment priorities plan. We are and we support the passage of the Electric Vehicle Development Act, which was recently enacted May 2022. And the Philippines is now intensifying its efforts on electric vehicles and pursuing possible collaboration with bilateral partners that may include the provision of training to help Philippine automotive and auto parts maker get certified for new and updated environmental management standards, as well as capacity building on design of electric vehicles and relevant parts and components such as batteries. And on furniture, since 2014, the Board of Investments has been providing capacity building in design and trends on sustainable materials. We have also been assisting to facilitate the entry of products that manufacture sustainable materials. Then we have further initiatives. Next slide, please. We also have industry development initiatives within the Board of Investments that we are pushing. First is academic industry matching. We have a program with private universities together with companies to explore collaborations for innovative solutions in solving companies' concern, including environmental related matters. We also have, during the pandemic, the institution of the Leyte Ecological Industrial Zone Master Development Plan. This aims to promote industry clustering with a view to reduce logistics costs between integrated businesses and ensure reliable power supply. The key consideration during the incorporation in the design of the Master Development Plan includes promotion of use of renewable energy sources and increased energy and material efficiency. It includes provision for buffer zones and open spaces for biodiversity conservation. And to reduce vulnerability to natural hazards, it uses accepted measures to help fight against climate change. Then, of course, we have the circular economy, where the Board of Investments is actively promoting by working with companies interested in reusing, recycling, and upcycling materials that may be used as raw materials for its production activities. We have that example of humble sustainability for it. And we also have sustainable packaging. We're actively coordinating with researchers and industries to commercialize technologies on seaweed and carrageenan-based bioplastics as alternative raw materials for manufacturing packaging materials. We also have the green metals, and under the green metals, the Board of Investment promotes investment in sustainable sectors such as green metals, which includes nickel, cobalt, and chromite. These are critical inputs for electric vehicle batteries. In fact, the LACE, or what we call the Leyte Ecological Industrial Zone, is actually in line with this BOI's industry promotion on processing of green metals, including copper, which is also an important input for the electronics industry. Okay. We also have another area where we promote is the hyperscalers. The government aims to promote the Philippines as a regional strategic hub for hyperscalers. Hyperscalers are enablers of various industries and the backbone of digital native industries such as fintech and digital banking, making the country more attractive market for hyperscalers. We see that the increased presence of this create multiplier effect, especially with the potential increase in demand for renewable energy and data center developers. Those are just some of the industry development initiatives for greening our industries. Then next slide, please. Then we also have the strategic investments priority plan. This is provided under the recently passed CREATE law. And here it's the BOI that formulates the SIPP. It's the country's investment plan containing the list of priority activities for investment promotion and facilitation, and they are granted with fiscal and non-fiscal incentives. So aside from the amount of investment and generation of employment, there are other factors that are being undertaken that takes into account sustainability and environmental criteria in the evaluation process of an activity to be listed in the SIPP. This includes adoption of adequate environmental protection systems and sustainability strategies. And in terms of nation building, one of the goals is to position the Philippines as regional hub for carbon reducing activities. Among the qualified activities under the SIPP that encourage sustainable investments are the following: environment or climate change related projects, renewable energy, energy efficiency and conservation, charging refueling stations for alternative energy vehicles and industrial waste treatment, energy storage systems, and health care and disaster risk reduction management system. Moreover, green ecosystem projects such as assembly of electric vehicles, manufacture of EV parts and components, manufacture of bioplastics and biopolymers are classified under a higher tier, which is tier 2 in the SIPP, which means that if you're engaged into these activities, you're even given additional income tax holiday. The next slide, please. Okay. Yeah. Just to strengthen as well how the Philippines supports green economy, we have under our SIPP general policies. This includes the following: its preference for utilization of brand new equipment. Of course, it is except during national emergency, but even during so, it has to be that the equipment is up to date, market and technology appropriate, and it should be compliant with environmental standards. For activities under energy, the project should utilize energy sources adopting environmentally friendly technologies that comply with several environmental laws like Clean Air Act, Environmental Impact System Law, Biofuels Act, among others. Also, new and expansion projects are required to secure environmental compliance certificate, or if it's not covered, then it's a certificate of non-coverage, and of course, to apply relevant environmental laws. And further, we also look into one consideration would be the revenue from sale of carbon credits pursuant to the Kyoto Protocol through certified emission reduction units generated from registered activity are the ones that will be entitled to income tax holiday. And we also have what we call a public welfare consideration, where you can deny the grant of incentives if it is injurious to health or to environmental considerations. How do we monitor and evaluate such? Next slide, please. The BOI monitors registered enterprises compliance with the environmental laws as a requirement for the grant of incentives. Some of the requirements imposed on their project that promote sustainability are as follows. Energy efficiency and conservation. There's a need for an installation of new equipment or system or modification of existing plant that will result in energy saving during operations and compliance with energy saving threshold as project boundary or limit of an EE&C project. Then for carbon credits pursuant to Kyoto Protocol, only revenues from sales of carbon credit are entitled to income tax holiday. And for recharging and refueling station for alternative energy vehicles, we place a minimum number of charging station at 5 so as to increase the use of EVs. That would be all for now, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Governor Ramos, for sharing this really slew of measures, policies in the Philippines that helps sort of promoting and facilitating green investments. And I think it's a very good survey illustrating Philippines' approach, for example, in the role and rather how sustainability, climate change, what kind of role they play in setting the investment facilitation and promotion strategy in the Philippines. We had a review of some of the indicators that Philippines has looked at, and also very importantly, and rather indicators that Philippines looked at when considering which investments to prioritize and how to guide its decisions in terms of domestic measures in place. And very importantly, which I thought was quite important for us to remember in the last few slides in the presentation, a discussion of how the Philippines monitors and evaluates whether the investment actually complies or remains aligned with the sustainability outcomes. So thank you very much for sharing that with us, and I look forward to a deeper discussion later on some of the specifics. Can I now turn to and invite Mr. Syed Mohammad Faisal, who is the Director of the Investment Policy and Trade Facilitation Division in Malaysia's Ministry of International Trade and Industry, to share with us Malaysia's approach on these three issues. Mr. Syed Mohammad Faisal is a career official in MITI. He has previously served as Councillor Economy in Malaysia's permanent mission to the WTO, and was also formerly a Minister Councillor on Economic Matters in Malaysia's High Commission in Singapore. Over to you, Mr. Syed Mohammad.
Thank you, Danielle. I hope just want to double check whether you can hear me clearly.
Yes, indeed, I can. We can.
All right. Thank you so much.
As well.
All right, cool. So first and foremost, thank you to CIL for having me here. Indeed, it's an honor for me to be here together with some of these esteemed colleagues. Well, I'm just going to go straight to the title itself, whereby we are talking about how we can facilitate foreign investment with respect to climate change mitigation as well as adaptations. there are some key questions that I've been asked to try to answer, and I'll try my best to answer some of these questions, which also include what role do sustainable consideration and climate change play in setting the Malaysia's investment promotion strategy, for example, and the kind of indicators as well as a priority when we look into considering which investment to prioritize and how to guide the decision on whether to assist a particular project. So, okay, next slide, please. Now, as a context setting, I would like to take your attention to this particular slide, whereby if you look at on the left side of the slide, WEF Global Risk Report 2023 highlights increased concern over short-term risk. If you look at this slide, you look particularly on the green color indication, whereby from these so-called 5 societal, environmental, geopolitical, technological, as well as economic, WEF Global Risk Report highlighted that 5 out of this is basically in respect to the environmental situation. For example, natural disasters and extreme weather events, failure to mitigate climate change, large-scale environmental damage and incidents, failure of climate change adaptation, and finally, natural resource crisis. So when we look at this the global risk report and we try to map it to our existing situations, whereby global events such as this also negatively impacting Malaysian economy. I wouldn't want to go to all this cost of living crisis, just straight away to the 2 green box, whereby society and industry such as agriculture are exposed to extreme weather events such as flood, as well as Malaysian industry might be facing some kind of ESG sanction and will be affected by, for example, carbon pricing mechanisms such as the EU upcoming carbon border adjustment mechanism. So these are some of these macroeconomic conditions that have the possibility of impacting Malaysian economy, which we are concerned with, especially on this environmental part. Next. So just quickly, if you look at this vulnerability to climate and environmental risk, sometimes especially to floods. If you look at this World Bank and also our Department of Statistics projection with respect to rainfall is projected to be more extreme in the future. You can see that more rain is expected, and this can lead to floods and massive losses. For example, the estimated loss from floods from late 2021 to early 2022 can be up to the tunes of 6.1 billion Malaysian ringgit, which is about 0.4% of GDP. And some of other examples, for example, the loss in vehicles can go up to 1.1 billion. In agriculture, 0.096 Malaysian ringgit billion. And examples as per the one indicated in the blue column. Therefore, as part and parcel of the whole this microeconomic level, when we look into creating our national development framework, we look into various initiatives which are aligned with 17 Sustainable Development Goal SDGs in our framing of this framework. We have the recent one as per on the slide. The first one will be our 12 Malaysia Plan or 12 MP, whereby the grand theme is advancing sustainability and to outline the nation's aspirations, ascending to become a carbon neutral country by year 2050. Malaysia has also pledged to the world to reduce its GHG through a series of conventions, including the Paris Agreement, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP26 and COP37 as well, to reduce the carbon intensity by 45% by year 2030. This is also as targeted in the 12th Malaysia Plan. In the middle, we have this what we call new investment policy. This is something that the Ministry of International Trade Industry involved specifically. In fact, this was launched in October last year, whereby we were cognizant of the importance of ESG elements and therefore included enhancing ESG practices as an additional goal to be achieved under the new investment policy. Integrating ESG factors sectors into investment is a growing imperative that can drive long-term value creation and encourage sustainable business practices across our region. So last year, October, we announced this. This is new investment policy based on national investment aspiration, whereby we want to elevate, we would like to seek a more high quality investment, foreign direct, whether it's foreign direct or domestic direct investment, but with a slight and ESG practices to be additional goal to be achieved when we seek this investment. And finally, on the right side of the slide, we have this Malaysian SDG Investor Map 2023. There is an agency called Malaysia Investment Development Authority, or MIDA, which is an agency under the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. They are set to launch, with the help of United Nations Development Program UNDP of Malaysia, Singapore and Brunei Darussalam, are set to launch the inaugural Malaysian Sustainable Development Goal SDG Investor Map in 2023. This particular map will provide insights and tools needed by the private sector to increase their investment toward the SDGs and fill in the financing gap faced by the government with regard to meeting the SDG targets. It would also provide the government with a clear direction to focus on new areas that could benefit from policy implementation and provision of resources, such as human capital and capacity building initiatives. So in making these three so-called national development framework, we considered that such 17 sustainable development goals SDGs and inserted into this particular programs. Talking about ESG, Malaysia recognized the importance of ESG in driving an inclusive and sustainable economy. Includes sustainable economy. So this includes incorporating in the latest ESG-based practices and defining new priorities in strategic sectors such as manufacturing, services sector, high-tech sectors, and energy power. Just to take manufacturing, for example, the transformation to drive increased manufacturing of ESG-rated products as well as adoptions of ESG practices. Moving on, in relation to this ESG, we have targets on this. When we launched the new investment policy, we have a target goals under the new investment policy, which is to enhance ESG practices. For example, we have to, the target, this is the quantitative targets of our new investment policy. We want to de-risk economy against ESG factor. We would like to be top 40 on sustainability ESG factor ranking, which is 46 in 2021. And also one of the important aspect of ESG, of course, is the reporting. So high compliance and quality ESG reporting. This is to in a way assess Malaysia's overall progress in ESG adoption. The ESG factor ranking is measured, which encompasses over 30 metrics across 3 dimensions, targeted to assess a country's ability to utilize and manage its assets while mitigating further risks. So these are the qualitative target that we have. This what in, I don't know whether you can see this. This is the summary of the new investment policy, which are also available on our website. Just simply by googling the new investment policy and the investment aspiration in Malaysia. Next. Well, talking about ESG framework, to show the emphasis on this is the in line with the recommendation of the new investment policy. So the government intends to establish a minimum ESG reporting requirements to strengthen the accountability of industry players in improving their ESG practices. So the Ministry of International Trade and Industry has begun consultation and engagement with local as well as international stakeholders to develop this national ESG framework for the manufacturing sector by 2024. So in this ESG framework, we are looking at its financial supports and incentives, its capacity building, ESG standards, and as finally market mechanism. So these are the things that we are currently doing. So we are hoping that we can finalize this by the end of 2024. And the focus at this particular juncture will be on manufacturing sector. Well, when we talk about investment in excuse me. All right. So when we talk about investment in green technology, of course, the most feasible pathways to net zero emission would be, something like renewable energy, which is include the following, generation of electricity without emissions from renewable sources, such as hydro and solar combined with advanced electricity storage. We also look at EV, production of electricity powered vehicles and equipment instead of fossil fuels. And finally, which is the energy efficiency, adoption of energy efficient technologies and processes to reduce energy consumption and minimize waste production. So these are some of the things, some of the investment in green technology that we look at, which we believe is the most feasible pathways to net zero emissions. When we talk about the green investment, we also have to fulfill the need for a green tech incentives. At this particular juncture, and although the narrative pertaining to sustainability, decarbonization, ESG principle, and green investment only gain popularity in recent years, but just to let you know, Malaysia has taken initiative to spur the adoption of green technology via green tech incentive since 2001. So these particular two green tech incentive, what we call GITA and GITE, which is investment tax allowance, GITA, and green income tax exemption. These relevant incentives such as these two are to encourage companies to invest in harnessing renewable energy resources, including solar, biomass, biogas, and mini hydro, and to use energy efficiency equipment as well as green services. So these are the tax incentives that we provide at this particular juncture. Then improvement on this particular incentive should be expected in the future. Next. When we talk about cooperation in green industry investment, we are looking at into these two sectors at this moment, which is the first one, green hydrogen. One of the potential new sources of energy is hydrogen. This has also been emphasized in the blueprint for fuel cell industries by the Academy of Sciences Malaysia, published in 2017. This is in order for Malaysia to have greener technologies, cleaner fuels, and low carbon emissions due to its high carbon dioxide emissions and other issues. In view of this, a system delivering energy using hydrogen is envisioned for Malaysia, and it's called hydrogen economy. There are recent prospective investment towards this, especially with potential collaboration with some countries, especially from the South Korea. So we are looking at, as of, for example, this project, there are some projects that we are currently doing in Malaysia with respect to this particular green hydrogen. When you look at EV, so this is parallel with our National Automotive Policy, or NAP, which is want to adopt energy efficient vehicles, EEV. So the manufacturing of components for hybrids vehicle and electric vehicles, such as lithium-ion batteries, is highly encouraged to support the development of country's automotive industry and make Malaysia a hub for manufacturing critical EV components in the region, in line with this particular national automotive policy. The NAP 2020 emphasized the adoption of EEV, including initiative to enhance the EEV and EV ecosystem, such as fostering technology transfer as well as cultivating expertise for the local automotive industry. In addition, under the Low Carbon Mobility Blueprint, LCMB 2021-2030, Malaysia aims to achieve at least 50% of electrified vehicles, including hybrid, out of total industry volume by 2030, and 38% of EVs by 2040 under the National Energy Policy 2022-2040. So these are government initiatives, NAP 2020, incentive allocation for the development of EV and hybrid components. So we are talking about full income tax exemption on statutory income, pioneer status, blah, 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 and full income tax exemption with ITA. So these are some of the things being encouraged by the government with respect to this green industry investment. Well, now that is basically the government take on sustainability. But at the same time, these three is local corporate. Very big corporate entities in Malaysia. We have Bursa Malaysia. Bursa Malaysia Berhad is basically exchange. They already launched the second guidebook in a series of 5 guidebook of the PLC transformation program, which includes sustainable, socially responsible, and ethical PLCs. We have Securities Commission Malaysia. They envisage that 10-year strategy blueprint for the period of 2011 to 2020 in recognizing the role of capital market in supporting the sustainable agenda. I think that the recent one, EPF, is basically the employee provident fund. This is for the pension. It's sort of a pension fund. So this EPF aims to achieve a fully ESG compliant portfolio by 2020. So EPF will define the respective ESG expectation for investment across sectors and asset classes. So they are committed in achieving this climate neutral portfolio by 2050. So these are some of that zero commitment provided by our local corporate sectors. In conclusion, I would say that we have this encouragement, implementation, and results. So Malaysia welcomes strategic investment and coalition in the green technology industry, with a particular importance of sustainable circular economy adoption, as well as integrating the SDGs and ESG principle into the decision making. And the result is basically trying to build a sustainable supply chains, take actionable initiative for net zero commitments, and empower talent management. With that, Daniel, I would like to conclude my presentations, and thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Syed Faisal. That was a very, very, very interesting. I found it very illuminating as well. Looking at the strategy that you have mapped out, that you have described, is a strategy that is overlaid with very practical tools. For example, the investor map, which I hope we can also get into, because that's really practical measures in place. Together with, of course, things like tax incentives, and to develop this sort of an overall ecosystem. The integration of ESG and SDGs into the decision-making process is a really critical point, and it speaks to what Dr. Abinano had mentioned in the first presentation, integrating the two. And the question is, what is the process by which this is done? How is it actually taking place in practice? I think those will be really useful questions that we can address later. With that, may I now then turn to the last speaker for today, that is Zhang Yawen. Zhang Yawen is a postdoctoral fellow with the Center at International Law. Her research interests include investment, energy, environmental protection, and before joining us, she was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where she had conducted research and recently published on possible damage awarded in investment arbitration triggered by fossil fuel phase-out policies. Yawen, may I now invite you to address us? I believe your presentation will look at the facilitation of these investments in the China's context, in the context of China's foreign investment legal regime, as well as, of course, the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. Yawen, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Daniela. So I'm going to briefly introduce how China's foreign investment legal regime facilitates green investments. Let me begin my slideshow. Okay. So basically, I'm going to cover both China's domestic laws governing inbound foreign investments and outbound foreign investments, as well as China's investment agreements. And also the Belt and Road Initiative actually plays a very important role in China's foreign investment legal regime. So I'm also going to cover this as well. So the beginning point, I think, in my presentation is the 14th five-year plan and the long-range objective for the year 2035. So this is a very important document in China because it basically sets out the guideline for China's economy and social development. And this one, the 14th five-year plan, is a landmark document because it's actually the first five-year plan after China announced its goal of reaching peak carbon emissions by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. So we can see that this goal is also included explicitly in the five-year plan. And this plan is more like a framework document. So based on the more detailed plans will be formulated in different sectors like the energy sector or other specific industrial sectors. And in these five-year plans, the government actually set out several actions they plan to take to achieve this goal. So I think these following three actions, they are most relevant to China's two-way investments. So the first is promote international cooperation on climate change mitigation. So this one, like international cooperation, is mainly driven by China's two-way investments through project cooperation and through like the cooperation between governments. And also the second one is to support qualified localities, key industries, and key enterprises in taking the lead in reaching peak carbon emissions. And also, China plans to promote the clean, low carbon, safe, and efficient use of energy and advance the low carbon transformation. So we can see that like without the facilitation of China's green investments, these goals will be very difficult to achieve. So what happened in specific foreign investment legal regime? We first turn to China's domestic law governing inbound foreign investments. So in 2022, China issued this catalog of encouraged industries for foreign investments. This time we explicitly said that China wants this catalog to facilitate green transition in China. So it adds many investments in the field of low carbon, environmental protection, green energy saving, development and application of environmental friendly technology, and also design and research and development of renewable energy. So altogether, now we have more than 100 items in the catalog. They are relevant to China's green transition. So all these investments, so they can enjoy tariff exemptions on imported equipment. Though there are some exceptions to this, but most imported equipment can enjoy these tariff exemptions. And then they also have access to preferential land prices and looser regulation of land use. So which means these enterprises or investments, they can have access to this land or buildings with a cheaper price. And also they need to only pay like lower corporate income tax. So these are the facilitation measures China imposed to encourage more inward green investments. However, maybe it's not surprisingly, but fossil fuel production and usage, they are still on this list. So which means fossil fuel production and usage can also enjoy these investment promotion measures. So it's somehow understandable because China got a very serious energy crisis in 2021, and we now also care more about energy security. So that's why fossil fuel subsidies, they are not really like phased out now. We still have that in China. So under this kind of policy, you can see that the development of China's electric vehicle market is a very typical example because it grows like very fast in recent years, thanks to all these incentives and promotion measures by China. So now we have a very large electric vehicle markets in China, and also we have many producers companies in this market. So it gradually replace the previous traditional cars we use, and it can also help China's energy transition. But also, we still rely on mostly fossil fuels. So now this is the energy mix in China, and you can see the coal still occupies a large proportion. So it's not surprising. I mean, like fossil fuels are still encouraged investment catalog, and we still cannot develop enough renewables to replace this coal. So this kind of like a mixed picture shown in China regarding investments in China. How about outbound investments? So these are the basic legal framework for China's outbound foreign investments, mainly like focused on supervision of these investments. We don't have any law in this field, so they are more like different administrative measures and also guideline principles, or maybe we can call like policy documents. So these documents that basically covers both ex-ante and ex-post stages. So which means it covers investments like from ex-ante like approval or recordation, and also ex-post supervision, including like report obligations, or maybe these government officials will check these foreign investments in different ways. So these documents, they all require that China's outbound foreign investments, they need to meet the requirements of environmental protection stipulated in domestic laws of host states or international environmental conventions that China is a party to. So the biggest problem here is that it really relies on domestic legal framework. So what if China's investments investing in a country that with like relatively weak legal system, then maybe they don't have strong requirement for environmental protection, and this investment they may like they don't need to fulfill like very high standard of like carbon emissions of environmental protection, and also environmental conventions. Maybe there are not many specific obligations imposed on investments as well. So generally, this legal framework they actually aims more at promoting the reputation of China's our investments than environmental protection. So at first, when we see that these requirements are stipulated in China's investment law, it kind of with the idea that China needs to protect the reputation of these investments so as to further promote them and to also reduce the protests or objections against China's our investments. But still, no matter what the reason behind these laws, they still somehow ensure that certain standards are imposed on China's our investments. Besides supervision, China also have like these promotion measures to target investments. So all these measures, they include eligible outbound investments, including those in the field of environmental protection and the development of renewable energies. So basically those investments, they can facilitate China's green transitions. So special funds are those that pay to investors as either subsidies for fees incurred during the operation of the investment or interest discount for loans. And credit support, including those that like it says that qualified our investments can enjoy a faster approval process, lower lending rates, extending loan periods, lower loan guarantees, and other preferences. And also these investments, they can also enjoy tax deductions and exceptions. And also they enjoy the priority in investment insurance, administrative procedures, and financing, etc. So basically, these investments with these conditions, it's easier for them to go abroad to invest. So these are the major promotion measures China has. Now turning to China's investment treaties, China has already concluded so many investment treaties, so including bilateral investment treaties and also treaties with investment provisions. So I have read like 132 China's international investment agreements, including those that are in force or those signed but not yet entered into force. So terminated treaties, and also there are 2 treaties that are not accessible, is not included in this database. So I found that generally very few China's investment treaties explicitly refer to the concern of environmental protection. So they are only referred to in 9 preambles and also 9 general exception clauses. Among these general exception clauses, there are 3 treaties that the exception clauses are not included in the coverage of investment arbitration. And one more says is even more interesting. So it says that no discriminatory measures adopted for public interest, including the protection of environment, is not covered in investment arbitration. So there are 4 treaties have no lowering of standard clauses, which basically means that states cannot lower their environmental protection standard just to attract foreign investment. So I think this provision is very important for China because it's a standard or common practice for Chinese government to attract foreign investments using lower environmental standard as a condition. So basically they say that as long as these foreign investors can come, then they don't need to fulfill certain environmental standards stipulated in domestic laws. And also there are 10 expropriation provisions with sophisticated state defenses, which basically means that states can say that it's a measure taken for environmental protection or some other public policies instead of indirect expropriation of investments. So generally, we can say that it's not very satisfactory in China's investment treaties to promote green investments, especially when we look at China's investment promotion clause in China's investment treaties. They don't really mention about environmental protection or climate change and so on and so forth. So it's not generally, there's not much content there. with regarding to investment arbitration, it's important to ensure like transparency and participation of non-disputing parties because they can raise the awareness of tribunals towards environmental concerns or other public policy concerns. Also, again, not many treaties, China's investment treaties have this kind of regime. So we only have to allow ambiguous participation to allow appointments of experts. So experts can make reports regarding specific or more scientific concerns like carbon or climate change, and to grant public access to the documents, like the documents produced during the process. And only one provides the opening of the arbitral hearing. So generally, it's not very clear, like it's not very transparent of the investment arbitration regime provided in China's investment treaties, which also means that maybe such concern cannot really raise or easily raised or accepted by arbitral tribunals if there are any measures relevant to facilitation of green investments are raised or relevant to dispute settlement. So last, let me turn to the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think this is a very important initiative, especially also for many ASEAN countries or Asian countries, because they participate more or less in the initiative. So the concept of Green Silk Road has already appeared when the Belt and Road Initiative was initially mapped. So in order to realize green development embedded in the concept, there are two major approaches under the initiative. So one is the encouragement of foreign investment that can directly promote sustainable development, which including environmental protection industries, clean and renewable energy sources, and new generation information technology. And the other is the requirement of environmental protection for other investments. So I think it's quite straightforward for environmental protection industry. So I'm going to focus on clean and renewable energy as well as new generation information technology. So actually, energy investment occupies the largest proportion of China's investment in BRI countries. So it's very important, and also they China claim that the priority are renewable, low carbon, and clean energy. So if these energies are developed well, they can be new sources to secure more stable energy supplies to China. Most of these energy projects can also be expected to reduce China's over-reliance on coal-fired measure. However, in reality, maybe it also again shows this picture. So in 2018, coal projects still occupy over 40% of Belt and Road landing for the energy sector. And also the majority of coal-fired plants abroad financed by Chinese institutions use subcritical coal technology. So it's the most energy insufficient and carbon intensive form of such power plants. Maybe through expanding overseas coal power industry, China is able to reduce domestic greenhouse gas emissions at the cost of so-called carbon leakage, which means that China can transfer carbon dioxide emissions to other countries. It may lead to lower carbon emissions inside China, but also maybe lead to even higher emissions on a global scale. So in order to address this concern, in 2021, China stopped building and financing more coal projects in BRI countries. However, meanwhile, you can see that oil and gas investment tripled and renewable energy funding actually declined. So here we can see that the development is not really like optimistic or not very consistent with the requirement of carbon emission reduction. So for new generation information technology, China actually initiated a digital Belt and Road program, and it aims at tackling sustainable development challenges in Belt and Road countries through the utilization of big data collected from various methods and means of ecological environment monitoring. So it can serve a technological basis for policymaking, including to make policies for green investment promotion. So the implementation of this program actually requires the development of several areas, including the construction of infrastructure that can serve the need of big data, the exploration of appropriate tools and methods to improve the capacity of sharing and community communicating data, and the promotion of application surveys of Earth-speed data. So these areas can serve the assessment of environmental threats in China and thus enhance environmental governance and promote green investment. So moreover, China also initiated the Belt and Road Digital Economy International Cooperation. So it advocates deeper collaboration in various areas, including those related to digital economy. These investment projects can build smart buildings, smart electricity grids, and smart transport logistics, which can also reduce greenhouse emissions in Belt and Road countries. Maybe the major problem of this initiative is that there are not many participant countries now, so less than 20 countries participate in each project, most of which they are developing countries. So maybe there are not many countries that are at the frontier of technology development in this aspect, which may influence the efficiency of these programs. So next I'm going to discuss a bit about the requirement of environmental protection for other investments in the Belt and Road. So basically, the construction of Green Silk Road actually emphasized the idea of ecological civilization in investment activities, which requires the consideration of impacts on climate change when constructing and managing infrastructure projects. So based on this, more detailed guiding opinions are issued. So the guiding opinions on the promotion of building green Belt and Road. So among other requirements, this guideline requires investors to comply with international and domestic environment rules, policies, and standards, promote the utilization of green technologies in the construction and management of investment projects, so as to reduce the emission of greenhouse gas and protect the environment. And also, another important principle here is the Green Investment Principles for the Belt and Road. It is published jointly by the Green Finance Committee of China Society for Finance and Banking, also the City of London Green Finance Initiative, with the participation of various institutions like Sustainable Banking Network and the World Economic Forum. So this principle requires investors to invest sustainability into corporate governance, appreciate environmental risk, disclose environmental information, enhance communication with stakeholders, utilize green financial instruments, and adopt green supply chain management. So basically, it imposes various requirements on these investors to promote the consistency of their investment with the requirement of climate change mitigation and environmental protection. So a very important part in this principle is that investors need to disclose all this effort and information regarding the investments. However, in practice, it's not quite good because until 2017, still we have more than 50% of the Chinese enterprises in BRI countries have never published any reports on corporate social responsibility or sustainability. So we had no idea whether these enterprises really comply with these guidelines or these principles. So maybe there are two major reasons for the failure. One is because of the large number of infrastructure projects. These projects are mostly resource and energy intensive, while the construction of these projects and their supporting facilities also have local, regional, and global environmental impacts, like the influence on greenhouse gas emissions. The other reason is that besides coal-fired plants, China actually is transferring other largest carbon-intensive industries abroad, like the production of cement and steel. So these industries, they can actually have great impacts on environment and also carbon emissions and climate change. So maybe it's also difficult for these industries to produce reports. So we can see that this is actually the impact of BI projects on the environment. We can see that there are some renewable energies, yes, and maybe there are also some investments that have relatively lower impacts on environment, but still high impact can also be seen from here. So again, in practice, it shows a mixed picture compared to the policy. So it's a brief review of China's low carbon investment in 2022. Actually shows a very good picture. So China spent USD 546 billion on investments that include solar and wind energy, electric vehicles, and batteries. It's nearly 4 times the amount of US investments, 3 times the EU investments. So these investments are largely promoted by China's incentives and also other fiscal measures, which prove that these measures is actually very effective. And also China's investment in low carbon infrastructure manufacturing account for more than 90% of the total investments in the sector. So in the world, is quite, so you can see that China's low carbon investment actually have developed very rapidly. So generally, climate change mitigation and environmental protection are taken into account in China's law and policy making. So you can see that despite that maybe there are not many reference in law and policies to environmental protection. They are really there, and you can see the concerns are clearly signaled in these laws and policies. And also, states facilitation regime plays an important role in the promotion of low carbon investments. They are the major driving force behind the growth of these investments. However, because mainly these policies, this is the policy-oriented regime, so it's not very stable. First, and second, it's also a bit difficult for investors to explore and investigate all different policies in different areas. So it somehow influences the transparency of the regime, and it may influence the efficiency of this regime. So it is advisable that maybe the policy-oriented regime can be gradually changed into a law-oriented one. So it can also enhance China's the capacity of China's foreign investment legal regime in promoting China's green investment. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yawen. I think your presentation offers a very useful lens, because we've been looking at inward investments. Your presentation looks at outward investments also, because the other critical part in terms of the impact of your outward investment strategies as well, not just looking at inward strategies and how that contributes to the global climate mitigation efforts, so to speak. So that rounds up our slate of presentations, very interesting ones on each point. We have a bit of time. I just wanted to spend this time to explore a few questions, and I do invite the participants to pose questions, and also panelists, please feel free to pose questions to each other as well. Let me just start off as the moderator to maybe just kick off with the first question, and maybe I can address this to Dr. Avendano. I mean, having heard your presentation and having heard some of the presentations and approaches in China, Philippines, Malaysia, and also Jensen's overview of the legal framework, I wonder if I could come back to you and really from your perspective, from ADB's perspective, what really are you satisfied with the extent to which the SDG goals are applied and identified in setting the investment promotion strategies in the Asian region? What are the areas that can be improved, and really what are some of the key sort of obstacles that may prevent the effective incorporation and, more importantly, the implementation of the climate considerations into investment facilitation policies?
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for the excellent presentations. I think we started with a more sobering presentation from Jensen, and we also saw some of the implementation at the domestic level, and we see kind of two perspectives on the same issue, and they raised very important points that I find really fascinating. In terms of the SDGs and some of the measures that are being implemented, I wanted to highlight a couple of points that are related to the presentations. One is in terms of what the economies are doing for implementing investment strategies in green industries, in green sectors. In particular, the presentation from Malaysia was really enlightening to see how this sectoral approach is really taking off, and also some of the trade-offs that are needed to take into account. For example, in terms of the green tax incentives and the implementation of the global tax rules that are being adopted. What are the caveats of this implementation if these measures will continue to be implemented, and if it is possible to be consistent? And that's something that we have discussed with some colleagues from other institutions, and we try to balance. And the conclusion is that many of these incentives are consistent and can be maintained under the new tax rules. Another aspect that I found interesting from the presentation on the Belt Road Initiative was also how there was kind of a change on the paradigm, and how the importance of the monitoring framework and the project assessments to improve the support mechanism. So this is something that on the story of the Belt and Road Initiative we notice, and also, and we document how the perspective has changed, and how they put a lot more emphasis now on the project assessment standards, the monitoring, and the effects of these outward investments that were mentioned have changed over time. So this is important when we consider the SDG 13, for example, because these have not been constant effects. The effects of some of these investment policies have changed over time. We saw, in particular on the BRI, some very detrimental effects, for example, on environmental outcomes, but these have changed over time, and today we are also seeing a lot of investments in clean energy on the BRI that are also important to balance. So that's an important point that I wanted to stress from the presentation, that is linked to the SDGs. And also on the point about the ESG that has been raised, I think there is a very important low-hanging fruit that perhaps needs to be discussed further, and it's in terms of disclosure and data that has not been addressed still in some circles. The data on emissions by sector is urgently needed, both on the side of FDI policy and on the side of financial markets. And there has been discussions, for example, about aligning the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, with the FDI standards that are used by, for example, investment promotion agencies, not only for measurement of the direct emissions, but also for the measurement of the indirect emissions and Scope 3 emissions that are very difficult to capture. So I think that's an area where there is a lot of effort to be done, and that is directly linked to the SDGs, because the SDG is really an effort for standardizing measurement of sustainable development goals. And we have a list of indicators that are collected by different agencies. And that's an area where I think there could be a lot of work to be done in the future. And that's one point that I wanted to raise. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Avendano, for sharing your insights from this presentation. Perhaps along the same line, maybe I can just turn to Governor Ramos at this point and just invite you to share your reflections on these series of presentations, what has come to fore, and perhaps if you could, in your remarks, I noticed that you had talked about monitoring. The Philippines presentation did talk about the monitoring of enterprises for their compliance with environmental laws as required for the grant incentives, and that kind of aligns with what Rolando just mentioned. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about this monitoring process. How is it conducted? Is it reporting, audits, on-site evaluation? A little bit similar along the lines of what Rolando just talked about. Over to you, Governor Ramos.
Sorry. Thank you, Danielle. Well, along those lines, actually, we still have several initiatives on sustainable development that's more on the finance side as well. It also includes some of the monitoring there. I did talk a lot more on the trade and investment. And well, on the monitoring aspect, actually, we have, it's both audit based on reports and at the same time on-site inspection, because we need to ensure that in the grant of incentives, whatever was promised, especially if it's they have to be climate resilient and all. It has to be validated before they can be granted with incentives. But just a little bit on the presentation of Hansen, which is really interesting on the investment agreements. Yes, I do agree that there's as yet to be instituted into the framework on SDG 13 or on ESGs actually. And there may be a need to look further into it, maybe as a chapter and not just as an area under the investments, because investment facilitation is just one of the facets when you really look into the ESG in general. So the Philippines obviously having being in the Ring of Fire, the Pacific Ring of Fire, is very much committed into doing much on climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So we are really looking into this very keenly and are doing a lot of initiatives, not only from the trade aspect, we also have a lot from other fronts of our government. I actually was given a whole document of paper on all the initiatives that we're doing. 15 minutes cannot actually cover all, but we are getting into having more of this climate change thing to really reduce whatever risk that may be done by we need the climate action, and we're doing a lot of climate change activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much, Governor. As always in such discussions, that we always run out of time, and it always seems to be a need for a further dedicated session looking into greater detail. And it's wonderful to hear that it's a whole list that we did not get into today, but it's very encouraging as well, given what we have been discussing. Very encouraging in terms of what is being done in the ASEAN region. Maybe with that I can turn to Jensen. I mean, you've heard about the actual policies on the ground, the actual practical implementation on the ground, and yet the regulatory, or rather the legal landscape, the instruments from your presentation don't seem to reflect that integration. Why do you think that is so, and how do you think that in trade and investment negotiators can actually integrate this? What are the obstacles to this being done? What are your thoughts on that, Jensen?
I guess one of the questions that I've asked throughout the WTO process is what value is being added by internationalizing these issues, especially given the relatively soft or conditional character of most of the commitments in the treaty and the absence of firm statements on areas where it might matter, namely sustainable development or investor obligations or responsibilities and so forth. And, I guess one sees that as well in RCEP and in some of the other agreements in which there are investment facilitation measures, but they're rather detached from what the purpose or goal of them is. So at this point, I think my general hope is that international commitments don't get in the way of what states are already doing in terms of adopting policies that fit their economies and fit their needs. That would be the worst outcome, would be that commitments in the WTO agreement end up dissuading states from adopting measures for fear that they would be seen as being discriminatory or so forth. But the next question is there anything to be done on the international level that would assist states? And Rolando mentioned the Australia-Singapore Green Economy Agreement. I talked about the draft agreement with Angola and EU. There's still pretty general levels of commitment. And I think that's maybe an area where negotiators, where academics and policymakers can continue to think, if we are going to act on the international level, how can we add value for states and for policymakers that they're not already doing themselves, beyond simply just increasing amounts of technical assistance and aid?
Thank you, Jensen, for that. I think it reminds me of the recent sort of WTO trade report, I think, where the DG WHO DG talked about the missing issue in the fight against climate change, and referring to the absence of trade policies in NDCs and the National Adaptation Plan. And so it seems to be a need for this sort of a more integrated two-way conversation. As you say, the greatest fear, what we want to avoid, practicing in both trade and climate areas, is that you don't want one to be an impediment to the other. And that is really the challenge for policymakers and legal negotiators. Mrs. Saikasa, I'm aware of the short of the time, but I'm quite interested in your very illuminating discussion on Malaysia's strategies. I'd like to have a little bit more understanding of the granularity and the KPIs. And we looked at the indicators. What indicators does Malaysia look at when you may consider which investments you prioritize? How do you guide your decision on whether to assist a particular investment project? Can you illustrate this with any examples? And the toolkit in particular for investor plan toolkit was really a very interesting, very practical example. Could you share some examples of these practical tools in that toolkit?
Thank you, Daniel. I think when you talk about let's talk about when we talk about providing incentives, for example, with respect to investment, or rather when we consider a particular investment, this is not in particular sort of screening. No, it's not. But basically, when we provide incentives, we have a kind of a cost of benefit analysis, whereby we incorporate some of the element. And for example, for a certain projects, in order for them to be able to receive incentive for that particular project, there is a need for the company in providing, for example, a Department of Environment assessment report first. So this is, of course, depending on what type of projects we are talking about. I think coming back to what you call KPI, I think this is all on the. Sorry, I mean the building has an automatic switch off light. My colleague.
Very great.
Yeah, because it's 7:05, so it will always switch off at 7:05. Anyway, I think other than having a cost benefit analysis, when we talk about, like I mentioned just now, under MITI, we are concentrating more on investment with respect to manufacturing related services, as well as some services type of investment. So the idea of developing a set of principles, because sometimes when you talk about ESG, there is no need for you to reinvent the wheel. There are also some principle, as well as a sort of a KPI that, for example, WEF have it, OECD also has it. So it's just where the application of it. So when we think about ESG, the thing is that how do you? So most of time when you talk about MNCs, they always drive the so-called ESG compliance within the company. They have their own set and targets. Companies in Europe, for example, even to the point that when they talk about the supply chains, their suppliers, they would also want their suppliers to be to align with some of this ESG principle. But when we are looking at the so-called ESG framework for the manufacturing industry in Malaysia, we also need to think about the SMEs, the MSMEs, that we need to also find where's the gap, and also assessment and reassess, as well as providing the necessary intervention when we talk about ESG principle. Of course, sometimes when we talk about ESG, it's always thinking about environment, but there is also the other part of social and governance that we need to also be able to put everything into the same equation. Coming back to Malaysian SDG Investor Map 2033, this is something that's being developed by MIDA. So I will be more than happy once we finalize it to share it, because this is basically the things that we would like investors to know. It's a kind of a checklist that you'll be able to be as a guidance in order for you to invest in Malaysia, for example. Thank you.
Thank you very much. there'll be a lot of attention focused on that guidance, I'm sure. Very interesting. I'm mindful of the lack of time, that I don't want to keep the panelists and participants too late. I'll just end up with one question, and then perhaps an opportunity for the panelists, each of you, if you wish, to say, what is the key message you want to use this platform to share to the audience, which is a mix, on the issue of investment facilitation and climate. One key message that you'd like to share. I mean, in relation to this, one question I had was really, are there sufficient synergies and mutual reinforcement at the moment in the discussions taking place at the climate change COP platform, in investment and trade related platforms, whether at the bilateral, ASEAN or global level? So with that last question and an opportunity for panelists to send a message out to the audience. Who would like to start first? Anyone?
I can start.
Since I hadn't posted. Yes, over. Ramos, yes, please go ahead.
Okay, just a key message, just to state that the Philippines is very keen and very committed in facilitating not only foreign investment, any type of investments that would really help in climate mitigation and adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you. Rolando, would you like to closing words on this?
Sure. Well, I will perhaps mention there is an institutional, there is something missing at the institutional level, I think, in order for this to work, and institutions probably need to change. Just to give you an example, ADB is changing in order to address this climate change issue in terms of how we address sectors, how we look at this in a much more horizontal way, and how we connect some of these agendas. So I think there is an institutional agenda that needs to be taken seriously into account. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rolando. And that reminds me of one of the key decision points of the COP decision, that really talks about the needed reform of international financial institutions, multi-development banks, in their internal processes and priorities in order to promote climate finance. And that's a very key point you raised. Janssen, would you have any parting words for us?
Well, maybe something positive, and that is with respect to the WTO agreement that's going to be forthcoming. I think one advantage or one opportunity for particularly for developing and least developed economies is the self-assessment exercise that each of them will be asked to undergo, to look at their regulatory environment and to analyze it for not only its efficiency, but also its coherence. And it's potentially a very useful opportunity for those countries, and there may be technical assistance available to look at their policies and to ensure that their policies are really facilitating and creating the legal environment that they want for investment, and particularly sustainable investment.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Very, very useful reminder. Yangwen, any key message from you?
Like Janssen said, so it's very important to see like how this policy and law apply and implementing in practice. So I think the transparency from both the lawmaking side and also the practice side will be very important to ensure that this facilitation machine, this mechanism can really be like can really achieve the effect that it intends to. So I think also it's something that like China needs to improve.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that came out very clearly in terms of your presentation as well. Predictability and transparency in many senses go hand in hand, and both on policy and on the law. That's critical. Mr. Syed Faisal, you have the honor of the last comment on this in this segment.
Right. I think, thank you, Daniel. I mean, I just want to go back to investment facilitation. I think that's a very important keyword, or rather two words there, investment facilitation, whereby we have been talking about this. We have an, investment ecosystem that, then, for example, Malaysia do believe that we have an excellent investment ecosystem. Therefore, investment facilitation is something that we will continue to do vis-a-vis, even to the extent to facilitate the investment that can provide the necessary sustainability element inside it. So coming to echoing Professor Janssen mentioned just now when it comes to WTO, I think the international framework, even if you look at ASEAN agreement, you look at the, so now WTO members is discussing the WTO GSI IFD. So it's also investment facilitation is something that, you know, continue to also include some element on sustainability. So this is very important, and I believe, like I said, investment facilitation is, I think, is key for attracting whether, you know, foreign direct investment as well as domestic direct investment. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Said Faisal. And with that, I thank everyone and panelists for your patience and indulgence in going a little bit beyond the 2 hours allocated. It's such a fascinating discussion. And so it leaves me on to say good day, good night, good evening to all participants. And it's been a pleasure having all the panelists on this conversation. Thank you. Thank you.